Osiris! Praise Osiris!
Sorry. His suffering is done. Not words of true. Momentous times are upon us.
Laird Byron is one of the main antagonists that Blake Langermann will encounter during the events of the second game in the Outlast series. Laird is a former member of the cult known as the Testament of the New Ezekiel, and now heads the splinter faction of that cult, known as the Scalled, a faction which has distanced themselves from their former friends and family at Templegate in an attempt to spare them from the sickness that now infects their ranks, a sickness that they believe comes from their sins, but in actuality is more based in sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis or gonorrhea.
God! Fuck!
The story of Laird as we know it begins with his affiliations to the Testament of the New Ezekiel. From what we know, based off the chapters written in the cult's holy book, the Gospel of Noth, specifically chapter 10, when Noth was going throughout the United States collecting members for the cult, he accepted any who would join, regardless of their past deeds or their situations in life, going so far as to mention that he turned none away, including those who were crippled. This line likely being a reference to one of his most avid followers, Laird Byron, who appears to suffer from a form of dwarfism. Laird likely joined the cult during its initial inception, being a founding member when the group found their way to Templegate back in 1971. However, unfortunately for Laird, his time in this so-called paradise would be cut short when he suddenly came down with a disease. A disease which the outer world liars might call syphilis, but which Noth made known to him was actually a sickness of the soul. A sickness which was the result of Laird's own sins, and a sickness that would result in his expulsion from the holy land of Templegate. Laird and those who'd been afflicted by their curse were cast into the woods surrounding the community. They still followed the teachings of Papa Noth, but were kept at a distance so their sins wouldn't corrupt the pure of the Testament of the New Ezekiel. This ever-growing faction became known as the Scalled, a faction which Sullivan Noth entrusted to his ever-loyal follower, Laird Byron. Noth emblazoned Laird as his deacon, a role which he graciously accepted, following the preachings of his prophet Noth, even as the sores and sickness took a further toll on his body, requiring him to ride atop his bodyguard, a man named Nick Tremblay. However, despite the bleak outlook for this devoted follower, one thought allowed Laird to cling to his faith, a promise from Papa Noth. The promise of a Scalled Christ, a redeemer of the Scalled, who would fall from the heavens and, after following several familiar resurrections, cure this sickness that infected these devoted cultists.
Forgive me, Lord, but I have to be sure. Open his mouth, Nick. Swallow. There you go. God, please, let him be your one. He's unmarked. He's pure. He is the Scalled Messiah. You half-wit dog's cunt! He ain't been transubstantiated yet. He ain't been born.
Laird and his fellow Scalled suffered greatly as they waited for their promised Messiah. Sick cast-outs from the Testament of the New Ezekiel flooded the festering woods as Laird patiently waited for his Scalled Christ. However, others among the faction weren't quite as content to wait for their supposed savior. The poor living conditions of the isolated forest, the rotting flesh from the uncured diseases, and the lack of nourishment from the main faction left many in the Scalded questioning if they would even survive to see their salvation. These issues forged a sense of resentment among Laird's flock for their fearless leader. And even as Laird reached out to his prophet for further assistance, his requests were met only with dismissal. Noth telling his deacon that the wretched sin of self-pity didn't become him, that his visions told him that the suffering of the Scalded would become nearly unbearable just before salvation, that he should rejoice in the decay of his flock, for it meant that the Scalded Messiah would soon arrive. And so, ever the dutiful follower, Laird waited for his redemption, silencing those who would question the teachings of the prophet with the fists of his mount or the fire of his arrows.
This is what they seen out of them.
Vile affections.
Laird and his mount Nick ruled over the Scalded with an iron fist, waiting for the Scalded Christ to finally arrive and bring about their salvation, waiting to the point where much of the flock could barely move from their tents, waiting as the sickness ate away at their minds, waiting as insurrection grew amongst the faction, until one night, all of this waiting finally paid off. Blake Langermann, the father of the supposed enemy, had fallen into the lands of the Scalded, just as had been prophesied, and Laird was more than ready to finally have his salvation. He nailed his would-be Messiah to a cross, so that he may die for the cursed sins that had wrought this sickness upon the Scalded. Later, the cross was discovered barren, further proving that this was the Scalded's Christ, and as he was found by Laird among the thorns, he was laid to rest, so that he may rise again, reborn and ready to free the Scalded of their prolonged burdens. However, all was not as it had been foretold. Upon his rebirth, the Messiah was not so willing to freely offer his flesh to be devoured by the Scalded to cure their sickness. In fact, he didn't seem to be acting much like the savior that had been promised at all, much to the chagrin of those among the faction who still held true to the words of Deacon Laird and Papa Noth. The Scalded soon began to get angry with their leader Laird, as the Messiah attempted to escape this forsaken village. Laird attempted to track down the one that he had waited for so long, but with every attempt, the Scalded savior slipped through his fingers. Unwilling to give up on his promised salvation, however, Laird followed Blake all throughout the Scalded lands, eventually catching up with him in a shack near the water. Tensions among his flock began to reach a boiling point as the Scalded Christ escaped Laird's clutches yet again, the prophecies of him curing the loyal Scalded escaping along with him. Laird Byron lived the majority of his life in anguish, the festering sores of his body being a constant reminder of the sins that he'd supposedly committed, while the words of Papa Noth promised a savior that would never come. And as he chased the last hope of his promised redemption, he was betrayed by the ones that he'd misled into believing in it as well.
Don't touch me! I said get your hands off me! Touch disgust me out of you! Hey! Hey! No! No, goddamn you!